don't forget and we don't forget. Good evening. Before we take a quick glance at the Does It Matter booklet, we are down to tonight and next week, and we'll wrap up this quarter and go into a new study. But we finished book 3 last week. I just want to mention, because we mentioned it quickly, but I wanted to just circle back and make sure to cover the last page, at least the last printed page of book 3, and that is it's got the heading "Counting the Cost." And I sort of touched on this last week. If you've been studying with somebody, when you get to this point, then you know them and you have an established relationship. So I've got to where I tell people I'm not being hard or mean or whatever, but I do want to really emphasize with folks the counting the cost aspect of this, because what I don't want is for somebody to obey the gospel, and they fall into this mistaken notion, this trap of, well, all right, that's it. And that's not the end by any stretch. It's the beginning. and it's no guarantee if you have that conversation, however plain, blunt, stern, whatever you want to be and are, it's no guarantee that they're just, they're going to heed that, because sometimes people still end up falling away, and sometimes quickly. Sometimes it's down the road and they face challenges. And of course, Jesus deals with some of that in the parable of the sower. But at the same time, I just want to make sure people understand that. And so I don't ever, when I get to one of those questions, we talked about the closing questions, those with the little star beside them in the booklet, and they say, okay, yes, I'm ready right now, let's go. I say, okay, but we'll take care of that. But first, let's go over a few things of counting the cost. And really just, 1, 2, 3, 4 verses here. There are more that we could go to, and sometimes I'll mention other ones, but Hebrews 5:9, where it talks about Jesus is the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. That's not a one-time thing, that's a lifetime. And I also hasten to make sure I talk to people and tell them this doesn't mean you're going to be perfect just because you've obeyed the gospel and you've become a Christian. It doesn't mean, well, I'm not going to sin anymore. And we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking. In fact, sometimes you'll have people that will say, well, I don't know if I'm ready yet, because I don't know if I'm able to live, and they may not come out and say it this way, but essentially what they're saying is, I don't know if I can live a perfect life. Well, none of us can. So I want people to understand that. But when it talks about the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him, it's a way of life. It doesn't mean I never make a mistake, but when I do make a mistake, it means I'm going to make it right, learn from it, and do better going forward. So that's Hebrews 5:9. Must we obey Jesus to be saved eternally? Yes, of course. Will you obey him? And that's just, again, counting the cost. Are you willing to make this commitment for your life, to be a follower, a disciple of Jesus, and to do what he would have you to do, to strive for that every day. Revelation 2:10, of course, the latter part of that verse, be thou faithful unto death, I will give thee a crown of life. Must we follow Jesus faithfully to be saved eternally? Yes, we must. And again, I'll discuss what faithfulness means there. It doesn't mean sinless perfection, but it means a striving to do what God would have me to do. Matthew 6:33, that's a big one. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Look, it's a struggle that we all deal with. We all sometimes will face the challenge of putting first things first, and there are different phases of life. I can't remember if I ever actually wrote the article. I had a starter in my files for a long time, maybe still there. Like I said, I can't remember if I wrote the article. I think I may have worked it into a sermon at one point, but each phase of life gives us unique challenges to putting first things first and putting God first. Sometimes people have this idea in their youth, well, I'm going to put off buckling down and getting serious about spirituality because, man, I mean, I'm a kid and I got so much going on with school and sports and extracurriculars and all this, and I'll do that when I'm out of school. I'll think about it. Well, then maybe they go to technical school or college or go into the workforce, and man, now I'm so busy with that, and when I get married, I'll settle down and I'll start thinking about those things. Well, then they get married and they're busy building a life together, and then maybe children come along, and well, we're just so covered up. I'll get serious about it probably, when the kids get a little older, and then the kids get a little older, and there's all that goes with that. And well, when the kids are out of the house, I'll get serious about it. We retirees, then we'll have more time. And then you got retirement. Maybe they decide they want to travel. Maybe they got projects going on. You see what I'm saying? There's always something. And so the time to obey God and get serious about living right, going to heaven, serving the Lord, glorifying the Lord is now. And that's the bottom line. And there are going to be challenges to that. And there'll be times in everybody's life when if we honestly evaluate ourselves, that we say, you know what, I'm not putting first things first. I heard a sermon years ago. I didn't hear it in person, but it was Brother Guy in Woods. It was a CD that somebody had made from an old cassette, and it was Guy in Woods preaching on Matthew 6:33. The object, I'm trying to remember now, the object, the order, they all three started with an O. That's supposed to help you remember it when you alliterate stuff, isn't it? But oh man, it's going to bother me until I think of it. But anyway, he preached from Matthew 6:33. It is one of the just plainest. I mean, he just laid it out there. And when he got to the part about the order first, First, and he just says, is it not a fact that most members of the church regularly disobey this? And I don't think he was trying to be negative about that. I think he was just trying to draw our attention to the fact that it's just so easy to do. But when I have two choices to make, one thing or two choices to make as far as what I'm going to do. I've got one thing over here that's in my own interest, one thing over here that is the Lord's interest in His church. Which should come first? Well, it ought to be the Lord. He goes on to say, if I have two trips to make, one's in my own interest, one is for the benefit of the Lord and His church. Which should I choose? And I've outlined that sermon. When I heard it, I wasn't preaching full time, but I outlined it, and I was like, man, next time I get to preach, I'm going to preach this. And I've preached that here before. I've preached it a number of different places because it's just such a tremendous lesson dealing with seeking first the kingdom of God. And so the question is, must we put God first in our lives? Absolutely we must. And then asking the question of the person with whom we are studying, will you promise to put God first in your life? And obviously we're looking for them to commit to that. And I tell them, look, there's going to come times when you have to admit to yourself, I'm not doing that. That's not the end of the world. You say, okay, I acknowledge it. I'm going to do better going forward. And that may happen at another point down the road. You acknowledge it, make it right, and you do better going forward. We all go through that. We all go through those times. And I've told a number of people, especially recent studies, that it's a lot like, I think I maybe have mentioned this, maybe in this class, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it's worth repeating. There was a guy that wrote a book years ago called The Believer's Wedding Ceremony, and it was all about baptism, and he talks about how, of course, the church is referenced as the bride of Christ in Ephesians 5, and our baptism into Christ is like that wedding ceremony. That is where we we're baptized into Christ. We're added by the Lord to his church. And so now we are united with Christ, and the church being the bride of Christ. And I really like that analogy. But carrying that a little bit further, when it comes to marriage, I mean, you think about your wedding day and the leading up to that, and even, maybe it's, I don't know, maybe your honeymoon phase was a month, maybe it's 2 months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, whatever. But there's that time period where you just think, man, she can do no wrong, he can do no wrong, and I could never be upset with them. But as you live with somebody, my mom used to say all the time, especially when we were teenagers, and you'd fall for some young lady, Mom would tell me, she'd say, you don't, and she wasn't trying to be just a smart aleck or whatever, but she'd say, you don't really know what love is until you live with somebody. and that is so true, isn't it? And love, you learn that love's as much a choice as it is anything. But as time goes on, everybody's got those little habits, those little things that they do or don't do that drives the other person crazy. And a lot of times they may be just, in the grand scheme, pretty insignificant, but boy, it just gets on my nerves. And it drives me crazy about that person. And that person that, maybe on the wedding day, you think, I could never be upset with them. You say, well, they're just driving me crazy. Likewise, here's a new Christian. They've just been baptized into Christ. I mean, they're on fire, and they think, unfaithfulness? No. It's kind of like Peter, saying to the Lord, hey, everybody else would deny you before I would, Lord. I will never deny you. I'll die for you. And Jesus says, Peter, before the cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight. So it happens. There's going to be, maybe as a new Christian, it just seems so easy to be there for all the services. But there are going to be times, we talked Sunday morning about the valley of discouragement. Maybe I'm in the valley of discouragement, and it's going to be difficult to keep those first things first. There's going to be times when I come home and maybe the new wears off a little bit, and all of a sudden it's Wednesday evening and I'm going, it's been a long day. I'm kind of tired. I don't know. I don't know if I feel like going. And I've mentioned before, but one of the things that from my childhood that sticks out to me was some of the times when my dad would say, maybe it's getting toward church time on a Sunday evening. As a child, sometimes I wanted to stay at home. Maybe there's an NFL game that came on, 4 o'clock or so, and I want to keep watching that, or I want to, keep playing my video games or whatever. And I knew Dad had been complaining about a headache all day, so I'm thinking, all right, extra game time, because he's not going to go to church. He's sick. And Dad would come in there and say, hey, get your clothes on. We got to go here in just about 10 minutes. Get your church clothes on. And I'd say, going to church? I thought you were sick. Well, I got a headache. I had a headache all day. Well, maybe you should stay home. Take care of that. They'd say, you know what? I can go and have a headache and be at worship the same as I can stay at home and have a headache. And, as a kid, I'm sort of thinking, great, But as I got older and matured, that stuck with me because that was an example. That was one of those teachable moments. I don't even know. I dare say he wasn't thinking to himself, well, I'm going to make sure, teach a lesson here. But he was just doing the right thing. And it stuck with me. And I'm like, that's an example that I want to follow. So putting God first. And then, of course, Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, and goes with a lot of what we've been talking about. Must Christians be faithful in attendance? Yes. And then the question, will you be faithful in attending the services of the Lord's church? And again, a commitment there, and there may be times when you realize I haven't been faithful with that like I ought to be. Well, what do we do? Do we just lay down and quit? Or do we, or are we going to be self-aware enough and honest enough with self to say, okay, I haven't been what I need to be with regard to that, and I'm going to do better going forward. And then the last question, after you're baptized into Christ, where do you plan to worship? Well, a lot of times, most situations, if it's somebody locally, then chances are really high that they would be attending where you are here at this congregation. But it may be a situation where they're elsewhere, or there might be a congregation that is closer. I always tell people, I want you where I am, especially if we've been studying, because we've established a relationship, and chances are very, very high that that's where they're going to be because of that relationship. But I also say to people, I want you where you're going to serve God and be faithful. And if that means a sister congregation down the road, that's where I want you to be. If, maybe you live 30, 40, 45 minutes, an hour away, it may not be it may not be conducive to your faithfulness to be at a congregation that is so far away that it makes it where it's very difficult, and it's going to hinder you being faithful in attendance. It's going to hinder you being involved. So in some situations, it's going to be better for somebody to be attending and a member elsewhere. But yeah, I think in any situation where we've been studying with somebody, we want them to be with us. But the bottom line is, the main thing is you be where you will be faithful, active, involved, or to reference 1 Corinthians 15:58, you be where you will be most steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. If I can be somewhere where I'm gonna be struggling, and I'm trying to be involved, but I got work, I got kids, and it's a long ways or whatever, I'm gonna do the best I can. Or you got somewhere very, very close at hand, you said, boy, if I'm there, I can be a lot more involved. And of course, there are other factors to figure in as well. Not all congregations have God-appointed elders. Not all congregations have solid preaching and teaching. There are other factors to consider, but every individual needs to look at that when you think about, well, where am I going to be a member, a part of the local body, and evaluate that in terms of not just one thing or the other, and especially not, sometimes people say, well, I like this congregation, it's bigger. Some people even will say go the other way, and they say, I like to be in a smaller congregation. Those, we all have our preferences, I guess, but the main thing needs to be a congregation that's going to make sure that, at least from their part, that I have opportunities to grow as a Christian, to be involved, active in the Lord's work, and to help me and any other members of my family to go to heaven. So, all right. Anything else, by the way, since we finished up those 3 booklets now? Yes, sir.
Say you have someone, they're not well versed in all scripture, but they come around the church.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that, well, I'll go with you. And you know that particular congregation is headed south. What do you tell that person?
I think in that situation, I'm trying to think if I've ever run across that.
Like in Montgomery, there's churches everywhere, but you can't send people to anything.
Right. And listen, we're blessed in this area because we got solid congregations around here, and I'm sure there are some, obviously, that are stronger than others or whatever, but at least in our immediate area, I don't know of a congregation that's not, that's teaching something, leaning out toward left field or whatever. There are some not too far away from us, but obviously in our immediate area is what I'm talking about. But yeah, Montgomery is a good example because there are some, there are a handful of out there congregations. And North Alabama is another example where they're just, it's like I was talking with some preacher friends of mine recently, and I said, I don't think I could ever preach in that area because it's a different, it's almost in some ways feels like a different brotherhood. And I'm not, unless anybody has family or comes from the North Alabama area, I'm not knocking a lot of good brethren. It's different. And sometimes you see almost like musical chairs with some of the congregations. You know, somebody gets upset about something silly. And I'm just going to go to another congregation. And sometimes it's literally like, a couple of blocks away. And so I remember working up in the St. Louis area. And St. Louis proper has several good congregations. But when you get across the river in Illinois, it's a lot more sparse. And so when we would have people coming sometimes from that 45, 50 minutes, sometimes up to an hour away to the congregation there at Collinsville because there just weren't a lot of options. And if they ran into something that was kind of a personality dispute or something, matter of preference or something that's not doctrine, you couldn't just say, well, I'm just going to take my toys and go down the road, because there was no down the road. You had to learn to work through some of those issues, and I think the church was better for that. And that's one of the downsides. There are a lot of positives, like in that North Alabama area with having so many faithful churches. But one of the downsides is that sometimes people don't work through stuff. They just say, well, I'm just going to go down the road. And then next thing you know, there's something comes up there, and they go to a different one. And sometimes, give it a few years, and they've come full circle, and they're back. But sometimes that's detrimental to unity and learning to be the body of Christ. But to your question, I still can't think of a specific instance that I've come across, but I think that if I had concerns about a congregation, I would definitely feel compelled to share that. If I had doctrinal concerns, or if I felt like they're maybe leaning but not there necessarily yet. I've been asked, even since being here at Bremen, not that long ago, I was talking to somebody about a congregation. I said, I can't put my finger on something that is just wrong, but there's just a feel there, and it concerns me. And so I'm quick to say, I'm not saying that they're liberal, stay away from them. But again, if I've been with somebody in this study and we've gone through these 3 booklets, I've never gone through one booklet, even one of the 3 in a single study. It's always been multiple studies. So even if you really say, we moved quickly and 2 studies per booklet, that's 6 different studies, usually at least a week apart. Sometimes I'm studying with somebody over a longer period of time. And that's another conversation I guess we could have, because sometimes I like stretching that out a little bit more, because it lets me make sure they're grounded in the scriptures and they know what they're doing, and it's not a rush thing. But also it helps to develop that relationship. And especially when we get to the point where if somebody's ready to obey the gospel, I can talk to them a little more plainly and not worry about, they're going to take me the wrong way or be offended or something. But yeah, I would feel compelled. And I wouldn't put it like, now look, there are some congregations I'd say, I'm just going to tell you, you don't need to go there. And I'm not speaking on behalf of every single person that's there, because sometimes people don't know what all's going on, but there's a congregation that I've had a family member in the not too distant past involved with. And at this particular church, again, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I expressed to that family member, I don't feel good about you being there. I just got a bad vibe. Well, it went on a month or maybe a few months, and next thing I know, here they are They don't have a preacher. They're looking for a preacher. But don't worry, they tell their members, because in the interim, Brother Rubel Shelley is going to come and be our preacher. And listen, that fella has for a long time just abandoned the gospel. I mean, I was reading something. There are a number of examples we could go over just with him, but I was reading something just recently. It was on a denominational, like a sectarian website, how he was talking about, and actually that might have been somebody else. I guess I shouldn't say that, but it was some preacher that at one point called himself a preacher for the churches of Christ, and he now is saying, I use tongue speaking in my praying to God, which is just mutilated 1 Corinthians 14 to try to justify that. But Brother Shelley, and as far as I know, he is a brother. I know he is a brother. He's a wayward brother, but for a long time, or for a time at least, was solid. I mean, faithful. I've got books in my library that are sound, solid material. But he's just for years now has been teaching off on so many, fundamental things. At that point, I told my family member, you need to get away from there. Because if I ever had any doubt, I kind of felt like I didn't, but if I did, that settled it. Because it's not a secret what he teaches and the things that he teaches against Bible teaching on things like worship, the plan of salvation, and so on. I said, and so that's how I would approach it. Like I said, there may be a situation where and you can say, hey, I understand. Maybe they say that, hey, look, that's so much closer to me. I think I could be more involved and whatnot. Okay, I get that. And let's look for you a sound congregation close to you that you could be a part of and involved in. If it's not as clear cut, I would express it more as, hey, I have some concerns about that. I'm not real certain about them. Some of our people, I say our people, Bremen people, that have moved and are at other congregations, they sometimes will ask me, and have in the not too distant past, about a situation in a particular congregation, and I might, one in particular I studied with, and I believe baptized as well, that I just said, because I know them well enough, and this was years down the road, but I said, we were talking about a couple situations that I said, it might be time to start looking for another home congregation. I can't make that decision for you. That's for you to make with your family. But what you're telling me is concerning. And hearing this and understanding what you're dealing with, that might be the best thing. And that's what ended up happening, and I think they're better for it. But yeah, that's I guess how I would handle anybody. We got our three elders in here, so y'all want to chime in on that? How y'all would? Yes, sir, Bob.
I'm going to let the elders speak first. If they don't want to speak, I'll say something.
Y'all want to add anything to that?
Part of building that relationship that you talk about during the study process, that's one of the most important things, that there's a trust factor there. And also, when you talk about authority, that's got to stick to the point when they visit one of these congregations. Some of these things should throw up red flags to them when they get there, whatever they're doing. So that's, and they should see it, hopefully they'll see it.
And that's a good point. What we talked about in book 1 with authority. And to your point, the example the family I was just thinking of that I studied with and baptized, the husband, they knew. That's the reason they were asking me some of the questions they asked, because there were red flags. And it was because, and to me, that's that's exciting. That's encouraging when you see somebody that you've studied with, and they're not just, well, I'm just going to find a place wherever, or even I'm going to find a place that, you know, the sign says Church of Christ, and we'll just go there. And sometimes there are things going on, and this is to my point with my family member. There are things going on that ought to be throwing up red flags, and just like, well, but man, the youth group is active, and we really like the youth group, and it's such a large congregation, and man, the singing is beautiful. Well, but there ought to be some red flags going up with some of that stuff, and this family that I was talking about before, that's kind of what led them and said, hey, we want to talk to you, and again, from the relationship and that trust factor, because we'd spent a lot of time together and studying and stuff, and said, hey, got some questions about this. So some of this just, and they even said to me at one point early on, I don't know, I can't quite put my finger on this, but some of this just doesn't feel right. And as we began to unpack it, it was like, oh, okay, there was more and more there.
One other thing, you know, when people come to Bradenton, the elders usually talk to them, meet with them, have some questions for them, but we've had a few people that come here, they had a list of questions for us about everything that we taught and believed here, and those are the ones that you like to see come, that already know what they're looking for, and they're, you know, they're investigating the congregation.
Yeah.
That's what we all should be about, because, you know, it's our eternal soul. We allow somebody to influence us, whether it be our children or ourselves, and we need to be on guard.
I like, and I've seen that a couple times as well. Jimmy mentioned, you know, the elders here, and a lot of congregations do this, where if somebody's going to place membership, the elders will talk to them, and they'll just, you know, some of that's just to find out their background, but it's also to understand where are you in your spiritual understanding. I mean, we understand we're not going to know everything about a person, but the elders want to talk to that person and just, or family, and just try to get an idea of that. But there are some folks that come to a congregation and they come to that meeting with the elders and they say, okay, but we also have some questions for you. And it's just to understand about the eldership and make sure that, hey, I want to make sure I'm coming to a congregation that's sound. And that, especially if I have children, are my children going to be taught the truth? Are my children going to be in Bible classes that are, well, Bible classes? And so there's, yeah, I like that. I've seen that before I've been very blessed. Every congregation that we've gone to, I've known the elders well enough beforehand, or else I didn't know the Bremen eldership as well, but I came and they sat down with me and they had some questions, and I had some questions too, but obviously most of my questions were answered just by what they wanted to know from me, and so we kind of got to know each other based on that. But that's really the way it ought to be. To your point, Jimmy, is that the elders have some questions for us, we have some questions for the elders, and it's making sure that everybody is going to be going by thus saith the Lord. Bob, you were going to say something.
So if your daughter came home with a guy and you came for supper and you realized there's some language problems with him and his clothes just did not smell exactly right, like some kind of smoke was in there or something, I'm assuming you wouldn't say, oh yeah, that's okay. I believe you and your wife would be right on the spot and say something like, didn't you remember the conversations we had? And she would probably change, okay? Because you instilled in her over a period of time what to look for, what not to look for. All right, she made a mistake, but she knows enough. Now, I said all of that to say this. When we teach a new converse class, I was teaching for Chris, and he wanted me to teach a unit at the end on false doctrines. And I'm saying, what? I'm teaching false doctrines to people that just became Christian. And of course, then I went crazy on premillennialism. But I think that's important in a new converse class.
Yeah.
And it's how you go about it. But if you can teach some warning signs of churches that are not going by what the Bible says, that's important. And here's my last thing. It is about relationships, but the relationship to truth to biblical truth is foundational in how people decide where they want to worship and what congregation that they want to go to.
That's absolutely right. And truth trumps all of the other. Man, it's such a large congregation. They're such friendly people. I've been on both sides of it. I was at a congregation, and I won't even give any specifics because I don't know the details of it at this time, because this has been like 20 years ago. No, 25. Time gets away. But I was at a congregation one time. I wasn't the preacher or associate preacher or anything. I was just a regular member. We use those terms sometimes. But there were the old-time preachers, I used to hear this a lot, I don't hear it as much anymore. The old-time preachers would say there were some uncertain sounds coming out of that congregation. And I knew it, but I had gotten close to some of the people in our college group. I had gotten close even to some of the older members that I really liked, but there were just, in our college classes, there were times that I was just kind of like, what is this guy talking? I mean, I'd been through preaching school at that point. I wasn't preaching at the time. I was in school. But boy, there were serious concerns there. Even from the pulpit, there were things that just kind of raised eyebrows, or at least for me. Jimmy mentioned red flags. I was so, and I still believe to this day. Maybe it was my immaturity. I don't know, but I was staying, and I really do believe. I don't know this for certain, but I believe God providentially brought Bill Wheeler. I don't think he's any relation. Probably is down the line to the Wheelers here, but Brother Bill Wheeler, I really believe God providentially brought him into my life because somebody put me in touch with him. He was in his 70s, maybe mid to late 70s, and he was preaching at a congregation about 45 minutes southeast of there. And he's talking to me, and he says, I really could use some help. He said, I'm just starting to struggle with remembering verses. He said, sometimes I get in the pulpit and I can't remember my thoughts, even when I take an outline with me. He said, I can't preach from a manuscript, but even if I take an outline, sometimes I get kind of mixed up. And he said, I just need to cut back. Would you be willing to come? And so I started preaching there. And I was blessed by that relationship, but also by getting away from, because it was not going in a good direction. I think they turned it around. I haven't been in that area in years. I think they did, the leadership stepped up, and I think they kind of took control back and dealt with some of that. That was one situation where I was just, I guess, too spiritually immature, and I was putting other things ahead of, some of those relationships ahead of truth. I've been in another situation where I left a place because, and I mean a place I loved. I loved it. And I mean, literally, I cried when I left. But I had to, because there was a fundamental disagreement with the eldership. And we're still on good terms to this day. It worked out. They actually, later on, saw what was some of what they were just not seeing for whatever reason, and we worked all that out. But they did come back later and say, hey, we understand. And you probably were right to challenge us on that, but we just hate it didn't work out better. But I knew what I had to do because of my conviction, because I had to look at myself in the mirror, and I had to look into the mirror of God's Word and say, I'm going with truth, not just because I have so many. We had a great young adult group there, and we were young adults at the time, and that was, our best friends. Some of them we still keep in touch with. But I knew what I had to do for my convictions. And so that is a great point. Truth has to go above, well, I really like the people here, or there's a big youth group, or there's a big group of people my age, and we have a lot in common or whatever. If I had to go to a congregation of 5 people and they're all 20 years older than me or 20 years younger than me, but that's the congregation that's solid and going to help me and my family to grow and to go to heaven, that's where I need to be. And so that is an excellent point. And I like your analogy with, the children, because, there have been times when one of my boys might show interest in a young lady, and I knew enough to know that, no, that's not a good fit for you. Not saying just a bad, evil person or whatever, but I knew it was not going to be somebody who would help you spiritually. And I would tell one of my sons, forget it. And I told one of my boys that one time. I said, I don't know if you're saying I'm interested and you're going to pursue this, but let me just go ahead and tell you now you're not, because that's not going to happen. And as long as you're, still young enough to be under my roof and under my authority, And like you said, there might be situations where you don't know that in advance, but you meet this person and you start seeing those red flags and you say, okay, we got to have a conversation.
But back to your daughter, if you didn't teach her beforehand, and then
Right.
she came home with that guy, and you said, I don't like that guy, now you think you're doing the right thing, but I'm going to tell you what's happening.
Yeah.
What's going to happen. It's not going to work out too well. So,
And that's the importance of that front end teaching.
Right.
And that's the value of that new converts class as well. And back to the original question. If I got somebody that they're just about to obey the gospel, that's a concern I got to have, because I haven't had a chance to have that, get them in a new converts class or whatever. And I may even just tell them, like, hey, I got some concerns. And if it gets to the point where they still decide to do that and I've got those concerns, I know what I'm going to do and what I would advise for anybody. I'm going to say, can you and I keep studying? And let's keep studying, and that kills two birds with one stone. It allows us to continue our relationship, and because we've become friends. And it also allows me to continue to make sure that whatever's going on over there, I can at least have a Bible study period, and we can together grow through a study of the Word. And if I'm right about some of those concerns, then, like Jimmy said, those red flags will start coming up for them. And that, so yeah, all good points there. Anything else on that from anybody? Good thoughts? Yeah, Leroy.
I'm just thinking about the decisions we had to make at GEN on speakers that even cost us support, because we couldn't afford to put people on there that were not sound, even though they might preach a sound sermon.
That's right. Yeah. And Leroy, you and I know, and I've said it here. I think it was, I don't know if I've mentioned it since you've been back attending regular with us, but Leroy remembers, I'm sure, a time when, and I'll never forget it. It made such an impact on me when Barry Sr. turned down $1 million offer from a brother, but it came with strings. And he wanted GBN put under a board of directors. And oh, by the way, he wanted to be on that board of directors. But Barry said, no, this is evangelism. This is the work of the church, and it needs to be under an eldership. And he said, I can still hear him saying it. He said, God's not going to bless this if we don't do it his way. And the guy, he ultimately made it pretty clear, look, if you want the $1 million, this is what's going to happen. And Barry said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. And he let him walk. But he stayed true. Yes, sir.
You've got her, especially going out to another congregation. I think they probably feel the Church of Christ is the Church of Christ is the Church of Christ.
Right. But yeah, they need to understand that. And that is a conversation that sometimes I will have with people. If I think that there's any chance that they're not going to be where I am, yeah, we're going to have a conversation. Well, where are you going to be? Let's find you a solid congregation. And and see if we can get you a place where you can grow and be, be fed on the Word of God and not, something else. And especially if there's family, that your family's same, and they'll grow and go mature in the faith and go to heaven. I do have, for the kids get up here, I've got several copies of Does It Matter if you need some of those. And we've got lots of these, so you can get those at any time if you want to. I've got another book that I'll mention, Lord willing, next week, God and Man. I told y'all before, I kind of cut my teeth on evangelism with this book, the old version. They've updated it and made it look a lot nicer. So we'll talk about these next week. I don't know if I probably won't have time to go through the entire PowerPoint of Does It Matter, but I may just give you a little sampling of it. That's what I was going to do tonight. But I'm glad to forego that tonight because these are really excellent thoughts, and I appreciate all the input from you all. Anything else on that before we dismiss? Thank y'all for the input. I really I love getting the extra thoughts and input from the class on these things. So thank y'all. We'll pick up there. Like I said, just hit these real quickly, high notes next week, Lord willing, and that will be our last Wednesday of the quarter.